Imagine growing up in the United States. You play Little League Baseball. You eat hot dogs on the 4th of July.
Right.
You pledge allegiance to the flag every single morning in your elementary school classroom.
Yeah.
English is the only language you speak.
You are, for all intents and purposes, completely American.
Completely. By every cultural metric and personal feeling, you belong. But then you turn 30. You go to the DMV to renew your driver's license.
Or, maybe apply for a passport for a honeymoon.
Exactly. Or you undergo a routine background check for a new job. And in that completely mundane administrative moment, you are told that you are legally an alien.
God.
You are undocumented. You are facing imminent deportation to a country you haven't seen since you were a toddler, a country whose language you don't even speak.
Yeah.
And all because the parents who adopted you, who brought you to this country and raised you, simply neglected to file a secondary piece of paperwork decades ago.
It's that visceral shock, that sudden shattering of identity and security. It is not a hypothetical scenario. It's the lived reality for thousands of international adoptees. And it's really the entry point into the massive and often hidden history we're unpacking today.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are so glad you are here with us. Today, we are undertaking a very measured, factual, and honestly, incredibly necessary exploration of the global intercountry adoption system.
Which is often referred to in our sources as the orphan market.
Right. Because for 70 years, the global public has been fed a very specific story about international adoption. It has been a story of salvation.
A total humanitarian triumph.
Exactly. But that story was authored by the adoption agencies, the origin governments, the destination governments, the adoptive parents, basically authored by everyone except the people actually being adopted.
Right, the adoptees themselves were silenced.
But the paradigm is fundamentally shifting. The global pipeline of international adoption is it's actively shutting down. And in the wake of that closure, adult international adoptees are finally taking the microphone.
They're reversing the gaze. They are looking back at the transnational systems that moved them across the globe as infants and children.
And they are dismantling that long-standing rescue narrative.
Yeah, with a new wave of rigorous adoptee-led scholarship and just devastating documentary evidence.
I do want to be completely upfront with you, the listener, about the tone of our conversation today. This is going to maintain a sober documentary-style approach.
Yeah, the subject matter demands it.
It really does. The source material you've given us to explore today involves systemic family separation, the manufacturing of fraudulent identities, deportation, and a tragic death.
So learning about these systemic failures requires confronting deeply uncomfortable truths. Truths about policies that were masked, for decades as the highest form of humanitarian aid.
I think a good analogy here is it's like reading a biography, but only reading the glowing summary on the dust jacket.
Right.
And completely ignoring the actual, often painful pages written by the subject of the book themselves.
That's exactly it. And additionally, because our sources touch heavily on legislation, government policies, and highly charged political debates surrounding immigration and child welfare, we really need to establish a clear boundary here.
Absolutely.
We're going to discuss specific bills, like the currently pending PAAF Act and the actions of various governments, the U.S., South Korea, Chile, Ethiopia.
But our role here is just to impartially report on the content provided in these sources.
Right. We are not taking any political sides. We aren't endorsing the viewpoints of the politicians, the governments, or even specific factions within the adoptee community.
Our goal is simply to convey the complex ideas, the history, and the lived experiences contained in the original source material you shared.
So with that established, let's just begin. Let's look at how this shift actually happened.
Because for over half a century, the idea of rescuing a child from overseas was universally celebrated. I mean, it was untouchable.
Completely immune to criticism.
So how do we arrive at a point where the subjects of that rescue are the ones tearing the narrative down?
Well, the dismantling began in academia, actually. But it was driven by profound personal experience.
Okay, trace that for us.
To understand this, we have to trace the rise of what is now known as critical adoption studies. If you were to look at academic research on adoption from, say, the 1960s, 70s, or 80s...
You'd find a vast library of literature, right?
Yeah, written by sociologists, psychologists, social workers. But almost entirely, those researchers were non-adoptees.
They were outsiders looking in.
Yes. And because they were outsiders, they measured the success of an adoption through a very specific, limited lens.
What were they looking for?
They wanted to know things like, did the child learn English quickly? Did they get good grades in school? Did they integrate smoothly into their adoptive family's community?
Oh, I see. They were measuring assimilation.
Precisely. The underlying assumption was that if the child blended in and functioned well in society, the rescue was a complete success.
So the internal psychological reality of the child was just largely glossed over.
Completely ignored in many cases.
Which, I mean, makes sense historically.
Hmm.
The researchers were measuring outcomes that validated the system they already believed in.
Right. But then the demographic matured.
The adoptees grew up.
Exactly. The largest waves of transnational adoptees, particularly those from South Korea, who were sent abroad in massive numbers from the 1970s through the 1990s, they grew into adults.
And some of those adults entered academia. They became anthropologists, sociologists, historians.
And they began to look at their own demographic, but they used entirely different tools. A pivotal text in this movement is a 2010 book by anthropologist Alina J. Kim.
Right. The book is called Adopted Territory, correct?
Yes. This book, alongside the work of co-theorists like Kim Park Nelson, it fundamentally crystallized what they termed the critical adoptee standpoint.
I'm looking at the notes on this concept of the critical adoptee standpoint, and it seems to borrow heavily from broader sociological frameworks.
It does.
Can you explain how this standpoint theory actually works in practice, just for someone who, isn't steeped in academic sociology?
Sure. A good way to think about standpoint theory is to imagine a city transit system.
Okay.
If you ask the mayor how the transit system is working, they'll show you a spreadsheet of budgets, on-time percentages, ridership numbers.
Right. From their standpoint at the top, the system is efficient and successful.
Exactly. But if you ask a person who actually rides the bus every single day, the person who stands in the rain when the bus is late, who deals with the crowded seats.
The person who experiences the system from the inside.
Yes. They have a completely different, inherently more authoritative knowledge of what that system actually feels like.
The passenger possesses knowledge the mayor simply cannot access, no matter how many spreadsheets they read.
Exactly. That principle applied to adoption. The scholars argued that adoptees have a unique, unassailable vantage point.
Because they were the ones physically moved across borders.
Right. Because they had their original identities erased, and because they were raised in entirely different racial and cultural contexts from their birth, they possess a critical lens that non-adoptee researchers simply lack.
They are no longer the subjects being studied under a microscope. They are the scientists looking through the lens.
And when they finally took control of that narrative, the themes they brought to light were in violent contradiction to the old rescue story.
They started systematically documenting experiences that had been entirely ignored. Things like profound identity loss, relational trauma, and severe racial isolation.
Yeah, that racial isolation piece is huge.
I really want to linger on that, because transracial adoption is a massive component of this history.
Oh.
We are talking overwhelmingly about children of color from Asia, South America, and Africa being placed into white communities in the United States and Europe.
This is a crucial element of the critical adoptee standpoint. Many of these adoptions took place during eras where the prevailing parenting philosophy among well-meaning white adoptive parents was colorblindness.
Right, the idea that I don't see race.
Exactly. The parents believed that love conquered all, and that if they simply treated their adopted child the same as they would a biological child, race wouldn't matter.
But the sources indicate that this colorblind approach actually inflicted deep psychological harm.
Oh, severe harm. It created a profound psychological dissonance for the child.
How so?
Well, the child would walk out their front door and the world would immediately react to them based on their race. They would experience prejudice, stereotyping, or simply the persistent feeling of being othered in a homogenous town.
Right.
But when they returned home, their family insisted that their race was invisible or irrelevant.
So they're getting completely conflicting messages about their own reality.
Exactly. The critical adoptee standpoint brought this trauma to the forefront. The pain of growing up in an environment where your physical reality is visible to the entire world, but denied or ignored within the supposed safety of your own home.
In the moment these adult adoptees began organizing and publishing these critiques, speaking openly about the isolation and the trauma, our sources show they hit a massive wall of societal resistance.
Oh, massive. And there is a very specific silencing tactic that society employs against them.
The weaponization of the happy adoptee.
Yes. It is a profound marginalization technique.
How does that play out in real life?
When a critical adoptee steps forward and says, The transnational adoption system is rooted in imperialism. It erased my culture and it caused me deep trauma. The general public, and often the adoption industry itself, will immediately point to another adoptee who had a seemingly wonderful experience.
Ah, right.
They'll say, well, look at your peer over here. They love their adoptive parents. They're well-adjusted. They have a great career. Therefore, your systemic critique is invalid.
Basically saying you must just be a bitter, ungrateful person.
Exactly. They flatten an incredibly diverse demographic into a monolith to protect their own comfort.
They turn a well-researched systemic critique into an individual personality flaw.
Right. But the critical adoptee standpoint demands that society hold two seemingly contradictory truths at the exact same time.
Which is often very hard for people to do.
It is. An individual adoptee can love their adoptive parents deeply, they can be grateful for the opportunities they had, and simultaneously they can offer a devastating, historically valid critique of the corrupt transnational system that made their adoption necessary in the first place.
Love for family does not negate the reality of a global child trade.
Beautifully put.
Now, putting my skeptical historian hat on for a moment,
Okay.
I'm trying to reconcile the timeline here. Large-scale intercountry adoptions started in earnest right after the Korean War in the 1950s.
Right.
It boomed in the 70s and 80s. Why did it take until the 2000s and the 2010s for this transnational network of critical adoptees to form and successfully challenge this narrative? I mean, why the 50-year delay?
The delay is really a product of isolation and technology. For the first several decades of this phenomenon, the subjects of the system were children. They had no power, no voice, and crucially, no connection to one another. An adoptee growing up in rural Minnesota had absolutely no way of knowing an adoptee growing up in Paris or Stockholm or Seattle.
They were existing in total silos of experience.
Completely. They were experiencing this profound isolation individually, assuming they were the only ones who felt that way.
So what changed?
Two things happened simultaneously in the late 1990s and 2000s. First, the largest demographic cohort of transnational adoptees came of age. They became adults with agency.
And the second?
The advent of the internet. It completely destroyed those geographical silos.
Huh.
Suddenly, the adoptee in Minnesota could find a forum online and connect with the adoptee in Paris. They began sharing their stories, and the realization was earth-shattering.
You're realizing, like, you have the exact same void in your history. You also feel this disconnect.
Exactly. The internet allowed them to unionize their lived experiences.
And as they connected, they began educating themselves.
Yes. They stopped looking at their individual adoptions as isolated incidents of a mother, quote unquote, giving them up. They started zooming out.
Looking at the bigger picture.
They began rereading their personal family histories through the macro lenses of Cold War geopolitics, the expansion of U.S. empire, and the reproductive politics of origin countries.
So they realized their lives were actually shaped by macroeconomics and global military footprints.
They realized that the reason hundreds of thousands of Korean children were available for export over decades wasn't merely a collection of individual tragedies.
It's systemic.
Yes. It was because the massive U.S. military presence in South Korea created specific sociological conditions, and because successive authoritarian South Korean governments made a calculated, brutal economic decision.
What was the decision?
Rather than spend the money to build a domestic welfare system to support unwed mothers, poor families, and mixed-race children, they chose to systematically export those children to the West.
Wow, that transition from personal tragedy to geopolitical critique is a massive intellectual leap.
It is.
But theorizing about geopolitics in an academic paper is one thing. What pushes this story into the realm of a true documentary thriller is what happened when these newly empowered adult adoptees actually went back and looked at their own paperwork.
Right, because that is when the intellectual movement unearthed chilling physical evidence.
The paperwork is where the illusion of the entire system just falls apart.
Completely. The foundational premise of the rescue narrative, the core justification for intercountry adoption, was that these children were orphans.
They were abandoned. They were parentless.
Yeah.
They had absolutely no one in the world to care for them.
Because you cannot ethically rescue a child who already has a family. The child must be a blank slate of abandonment for the narrative to work.
So the most destabilizing discovery of this entire historical reckoning is the revelation of what we call falsified origins.
Yes. When adult adoptees began requesting their original files, hiring private investigators, or traveling back to their origin countries, they discovered that agencies had routinely, systematically, and deliberately documented children who had known living parents as abandoned orphans.
Wait, how does that actually happen mechanically? I mean, how does a child with a mother become an orphan on paper?
Well, the mechanisms varied by country and era, but they all relied on exploiting vulnerable people and a total lack of oversight.
Give me an example.
In some cases, a mother facing extreme temporary poverty would place her child in an orphanage just for a few months, intending to come back when she found work.
Like a temporary daycare situation.
Exactly. But the orphanage would take the child, immediately declare them abandoned, alter their birth date, give them a new name, and process them for international adoption.
Got it.
By the time the mother returned, the child was already in America or Europe, and the mother was told the child had died or simply disappeared. In other cases, recruiters actively went into impoverished neighborhoods and coerced or tricked illiterate parents into signing relinquishment papers they couldn't even read.
It is the industrial-scale forgery of human identities.
It really is.
To truly grasp the psychological weight of this, we need to look at the case study of Dean Borche-Liam. Her story is the perfect emblem for the devastation of switched and falsified identities.
Dean Borche-Liam is an incredibly influential adoptee filmmaker. Her documentaries, specifically First Person Plural and In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee, are essential viewing for understanding this history.
And her own life is the subject of her work.
Yes. She was adopted from South Korea to the United States in the late 1960s. Her American family received paperwork stating her name was Cha Jung-hee, that she was a true orphan, and that both of her biological parents were dead.
And she grew up internalizing that identity. She believed she was Cha Jung-hee. I mean, why wouldn't she? It was certified by government stamps and international agencies.
Exactly. But decades later, through a painstaking process of investigation, she discovers a mind-bending truth.
She is not Cha Jung-hee.
She is not. Her biological name was Kang Ok-jin. She was not an orphan. She had a living mother, brothers, and sisters still in Korea.
So what actually happened in the orphanage? How did she get someone else's name?
The orphanage had a file for a girl named Cha Jung-hee. That girl had been matched with Dean's future American family.
Okay.
The family was sending sponsorship money and waiting for the adoption to finalize. But right before the departure date, the real Cha Jung-hee's biological father came to the orphanage and reclaimed his daughter.
Okay, so the agency now has a problem.
Mm-hmm.
They have a paying American family expecting a specific child, and that child is no longer available.
Right. And instead of telling the American family the truth and starting the matching process over, the agency administrators simply looked around the orphanage.
Oh, my God.
They found Kang Ok-jin, who had been placed there temporarily by her mother, who was struggling with severe poverty.
And they just swapped them.
They instructed young Kang Ok-jin to start answering to the name Cha Jung-hee. They put her on a plane with the other girl's paperwork and sent her to America under a completely fabricated identity.
They used a human being as a fungible commodity to fulfill a contract. Two completely different girls living under the exact same name on paper.
Yes.
The psychological devastation of finding that out as an adult is almost unimaginable. Discovering that your birthday, your name, your entire origin story belonged to someone else.
And meanwhile, your actual family was completely erased from the administrative record.
Dean's case is horrifying, but the most important takeaway is that it's not an anomaly. It is emblematic of a systemic institutional practice.
It is, and we don't have to rely solely on individual anecdotes to prove this anymore. The historical reckoning has become official state policy through the work of the Korea Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Now, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are usually mechanisms reserved for investigating massive, society-altering atrocities.
Right, like post-apartheid South Africa, post-genocide Rwanda, investigations into brutal dictatorships.
So the fact that South Korea initiated a TRC specifically to investigate the inter-country adoption system tells you everything you need to know about the gravity of the allegations.
Operating from 2022 to 2025, the TRC took on an unprecedented mandate. They received 367 specific complaints from adult adoptees residing in 11 different destination countries.
These were adoptees stepping forward and saying, "My origin documents are fake. I was stolen from my family. I was sold into an adoption market."
Exactly. And the commission began investigating those claims, digging into the archives of the government and the massive adoption agencies.
And what did they find?
In March 2025, the TRC released a watershed interim report. Of the cases they had fully investigated by that point, they definitively confirmed 56 out of 367 cases as absolute, undeniable human rights violations.
That is a staggering percentage.
They found that agencies systematically manipulated documents, routinely and falsely listing children as quote-unquote orphans, specifically to expedite their export to Western countries.
And the language used in that official government report is incredibly stark. They didn't call it a failure of child welfare. They explicitly described the historical program as a state-enabled child trade.
They confirmed the critical adoptee standpoint. The TRC verified that the motivation driving this massive export was largely economic.
Right.
The authoritarian South Korean governments of the 70s and 80s actively promoted foreign adoption to avoid the immense financial burden of building a domestic welfare state.
Every child placed on a plane to America or Europe was a mouth the state did not have to feed, and education the state did not have to fund.
And furthermore, it brought in millions of dollars in foreign currency through agency processing fees.
It is a breathtakingly cynical calculation by a government regarding its most vulnerable citizens.
It really is.
But if we expand our lens beyond South Korea, the sources make it clear that this horrifying pattern of manufactured orphans is a global phenomenon.
Yes, the exact same mechanics appear in completely different regions.
Let's look at the history of Chile under the Pinochet dictatorship.
The Chilean history, particularly from the 1970s into the 1990s, reveals an almost identical playbook of falsified origins, but with an arguably more sinister execution at the ground level.
More sinister how?
We're talking about the hospitals themselves being complicit. Currently, there are an estimated 20,000 cases under investigation in Chile.
20,000 cases of suspected falsification.
Yes. The pattern involved targeting poor, predominantly indigenous women. A mother would go into a hospital to give birth. After the delivery, the doctors, nurses, or social workers would tell the mother that her baby was stillborn or had died shortly after birth.
God. And when the grieving mother asked to see the body to say goodbye,
She was denied. She was told the hospital had already disposed of the remains for sanitary reasons.
but the baby wasn't dead.
The baby was perfectly healthy. The hospital staff would alter the birth registry, classify the child as abandoned or unparented, move them to an orphanage, and immediately traffic them out of the country for lucrative international adoptions in North America and Europe.
That's just monstrous.
Today, grassroots organizations like Connecting Roots are doing the painstaking, emotionally grueling work of using commercial DNA databases to track down these stolen children and reunite them with the Chilean mothers who spent decades mourning babies that were actually alive.
And we see another chilling variation of this manufactured supply in Ethiopia.
Indeed. Prior to 2018, Ethiopia was one of the largest hubs for international adoption in the world. But investigative journalists and adoptee advocates uncovered a widespread, highly organized practice of what they termed harvesting children.
Harvesting. The language itself commodifies the children. How did the harvesting work?
Adoption agency recruiters would travel deep into rural, highly impoverished Ethiopian villages. They would find families struggling with famine or extreme poverty.
And what would they tell them?
The recruiters would convince the parents to send their children to the city for education. They promised the parents it was a temporary boarding school arrangement, that the child would receive schooling and meals, and that the parents could visit or eventually bring them home.
So the parents thought they were giving their child a temporary educational opportunity, a chance to survive.
Exactly. But the moment the child arrived at the agency facility in the city, the boarding school promise vanished. The child's paperwork was entirely altered.
They were reclassified as an abandoned orphan.
Yes, completely severing their legal tie to their living parents in the village. They were then adopted out to Western families who paid thousands of dollars in fees, believing they were saving a child from starvation.
The living parents were administratively erased from existence.
The scale of this fraud, exposed by groups like Batista Falega, who worked to reunite these fractured families, became so undeniable and so internationally embarrassing that in 2018, the Ethiopian government took the extraordinary step of completely banning intercountry adoption.
They shut the entire system down rather than try to regulate it.
They had to.
When you look at Korea, Chile, and Ethiopia together, the pattern is impossible to ignore. It looks exactly like a corrupted global supply chain.
That's the perfect way to frame it.
Think about a highly desired commodity, like a rare earth mineral needed for smartphones.
Okay.
When foreign demand for that mineral becomes intensely high, and buyers are willing to pay top dollar while turning a blind eye to where it comes from, the ethical sourcing completely collapses.
Right.
The immense financial demand actively creates a black market, incentivizing people to steal or illegally mine the resource to fulfill the orders.
Yeah.
In the context of international adoption, the demand came from well-meaning, often wealthy families in the West who desperately wanted to form a family. But the supply that was being manufactured to meet that demand was human beings.
It's a devastating analogy, but it maps perfectly onto the historical evidence. The massive demand from Western countries, backed by significant financial resources, created an overwhelming economic incentive for origin countries to manufacture supply.
The ethical blind spots of the West were vast.
Entirely obscured by the pervasive belief that moving a child from the global South to the global North was inherently an act of rescue.
So, we have established that the starting paperwork, the origin documents defining who these children were, was frequently a complete fabrication.
Right.
But the tragedy does not stop there. The story shifts from historical fraud into an active, ongoing life-or-death crisis when we look at the destination document.
This is where it gets incredibly urgent.
Because if the paperwork at the beginning of the journey was a lie, the paperwork at the end of the journey, the document supposed to guarantee these children a secure life in their new countries, was often entirely non-existent.
We have to examine the citizenship gap. The citizenship gap is arguably the most devastating administrative failure of the entire inter-country adoption system. For decades, the legal mechanics of international adoption into the United States were dangerously bifurcated.
Explain that bifurcation.
When an American citizen went overseas and adopted a child, that legal adoption finalized their parental rights. A judge declared them the legal parents.
Okay, that makes sense.
However, that adoption decree did not automatically grant the child United States citizenship.
Which to an outside observer sounds completely illogical. You legally adopt the child into your family, you bring them through U.S. customs with government approval, but they are technically classified as immigrants, requiring a separate, secondary naturalization process to become citizens of the country they now live in.
Precisely. The child arrived on a visa. The adoptive parents were legally required to file separate naturalization paperwork to secure the child's citizenship.
And here is where the system collapsed.
Completely. Many adoptive parents simply didn't know this was required. The agencies often failed to properly instruct them. Some parents assumed the adoption decree itself was sufficient proof of belonging. In other tragic cases, families couldn't afford the additional naturalization fees, or they simply neglected to do it out of sheer irresponsibility.
So you have a growing population of children, entirely dependent on their adoptive parents, living in a state of invisible legal vulnerability.
Yeah.
Eventually, the U.S. government recognized this was a massive structural problem, right? They attempted to fix it with legislation.
They attempted a fix with the Child Citizenship Act of 2000.
Okay, the CCA.
On paper, the intent of the CCA was to finally resolve the issue by granting automatic derivative citizenship to all foreign-born adoptees of American parents.
That sounds like exactly what was needed.
But the legislation contained a catastrophic mechanical flaw. The law stipulated that automatic citizenship only applied to adoptees who were under the age of 18 on the day the law took effect, which was February 27, 2001.
Wait, why would Congress write a law with such a devastating cutoff?
In U.S. immigration law, there is a persistent legislative fear of creating loopholes for adults to bypass normal immigration queues. Congress frequently imposes age caps to ensure benefits apply only to dependent children.
Okay, but in doing so with the CCA, they completely failed to account for the unique structural reality of adoptees.
Exactly. These were not adults trying to sneak into the country. These were people brought here legally as infants who were denied citizenship solely because their American parents failed to file paperwork on their behalf.
The mechanic of that cutoff date created a literal gap. If you were an international adoptee born before February 27, 1983, meaning you were 18 years and 1 day old when the law went into effect, you got absolutely nothing. You remained a non-citizen.
And the scale of this legislative failure is staggering. It is estimated that between 18,000 to 75,000 adult adoptees were left trapped in this gap.
Up to 75,000 people.
Tens of thousands of people left without legal status in the country of the parents who supposedly rescued them.
And the consequences of lacking that citizenship are not just administrative headaches. Because they are legally considered non-citizens, any run-in with the law, even a minor infraction, or an offense committed decades earlier can trigger deportation proceedings by Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Yes.
To understand the human cost of this, we must look at the deeply harrowing story of Adam Krapser.
Adam Crapser's story is one of the most profound indictments of both the adoption system and the immigration system.
Walk us through what happened to him.
Adam was adopted from South Korea and brought to the United States at the age of 3. His life in America was a nightmare. He was placed with an adoptive family that subjected him to severe physical and emotional abuse.
God.
The state eventually intervened, removed him from that abusive home, and placed him into the foster care system.
So he was a victim of severe child abuse by American citizens.
Right. And eventually, the foster system placed him with a second adoptive family. Unbelievably, this second family also severely abused him and eventually kicked him out of the house when he was a teenager.
And crucially, amidst all of this trauma, neither the first adoptive family, nor the state foster system, nor the second adoptive family ever bothered to finalize his naturalization paperwork.
None of them did. So Adam becomes an adult. He is a survivor of horrific systemic abuse. He's struggling to build a life, to start his own family. He discovers that he is completely undocumented.
Wow.
Now, during his youth, directly related to the trauma of his abuse and his struggle for survival after being kicked out, Adam had accrued some minor criminal convictions.
Right, things like breaking into his former adoptive parents' house to retrieve the Korean Bible that came with him from the orphanage.
Exactly. Decades later, Adam, trying to do the right thing, applies for a green card to finally regularize his immigration status and secure his future with his family.
Because he wants to be legitimate.
But the moment his application hits Homeland Security, the system flags those old minor convictions from his youth. Because he's a non-citizen, those convictions made him deportable. ICE-initiated deportation proceedings.
It is a staggering cruelty.
Hmm.
The United States government took a man who had been imported as a toddler, who was severely abused by American citizens under the watch of American courts, and instead of protecting him, they deported him.
Yeah.
They sent him back to Seoul in 2016, a country he hadn't seen since he was 3 years old, whose language he did not speak.
He was essentially exiled, but Adam Crapser refused to vanish. Once in Korea, he became a public face for this crisis, and he launched a landmark legal battle.
He sued, right?
He sued the South Korean government and Holt Children's Services, the massive, historic agency that facilitated his original adoption. He argued that they had completely failed in their fundamental duty of care by sending him to a foreign country without ensuring his basic legal citizenship would be secured.
That lawsuit has been winding its way through the Korean courts for years. What is the current status?
It's been a roller coaster. In 2023, a lower Korean court actually issued a historic ruling ordering Holt to pay Adam damages.
Wow, that's huge.
It was a massive victory that signaled agencies might finally be held accountable for the citizenship gap. But then, in a deeply sobering development just this past January, on January 8, 2025, the Seoul High Court overturned that award.
Why did they overturn it? On what grounds does the agency escape responsibility?
The High Court cleared both the government and Holt of liability primarily by citing the statute of limitations.
Oh, God.
They also argued the difficulty of legally proving intentional systemic negligence versus individual localized bureaucratic errors from 40 years ago. They essentially ruled that while it was a tragedy, too much time had passed to hold the institutions legally and financially responsible.
The system completely washes its hands of the person it failed.
Exactly.
But as enraging and tragic as Adam's story is, the citizenship gap has had even more lethal consequences. We must discuss the case of Philip Clay.
Philip Clay's story represents the ultimate failure of the rescue narrative. Like Adam, Philip was adopted from South Korea as a small child. He was placed with a family in Pennsylvania.
And like Adam, his adoptive parents never secured his U.S. citizenship.
Never did. And Philip struggled deeply throughout his life.
He suffered from severe mental health challenges and substance abuse issues, correct?
He did. Because he was trapped in the citizenship gap, his subsequent run-ins with the criminal justice system related to those struggles made him a target for ICE. In 2012, the United States government deported Philip Clay back to South Korea.
A man battling severe mental illness, stripped of his entire support system, dropped into a country where he is a complete stranger.
He was entirely adrift in Seoul. He didn't speak Korean. He had no safety net. He spent years struggling to survive in a society he didn't understand. And tragically, on May 21st, 2017, Philip Clay died by suicide in Seoul.
That is just, I find myself struggling to process the sheer bureaucratic negligence required for this to happen.
It's infuriating.
How could the legal systems of two nations allow parents to legally adopt a child, fundamentally severing them from their homeland and their biological identity, but completely fail to guarantee their basic right to exist in their new country?
Yeah. And more enraging is the timeline. The Child Citizenship Act passed in 2000. It's been 25 years since this glaring loophole was created. Why hasn't Congress closed it?
The failure is rooted in the blinding power of the rescue narrative. For decades, society, lawmakers, and child welfare agencies were so enamored with the emotional idea of adoption as a pure act of salvation that they assumed love and a new bedroom were sufficient.
Right, they completely ignored the rigorous, ironclad legal protections required to guarantee a human being's rights.
The assumption was, we save them from a poor country, what more do they need?
Yeah.
They didn't consider that a child needs legal armor.
But the reality of the gap has been known for 2 decades. Why is it so hard to pass a bill simply correcting an administrative oversight?
Because adult adoptees are a politically marginalized demographic, they do not have massive corporate lobbying budgets. And crucially, any legislation seeking to fix this gets entangled in the notoriously toxic, gridlocked landscape of U.S. immigration politics.
Of course. Fixing the gap requires amending immigration law. And in the current political climate, almost any immigration bill is instantly paralyzed by partisan fighting, regardless of the humanitarian urgency.
But the grease over Philip Clay and the outrage over Adam Crapser's deportation did not just dissipate. It galvanized the adoptee community.
You really did.
They realized that if the agencies and the governments that created the crisis were not going to fix it, they had to build their own political power. This brings us to the immense grassroots lobbying effort currently underway.
The burden of correcting this historical injustice has fallen entirely onto the shoulders of the adoptees themselves. Grassroots organizations have formed to take on this grueling work.
Who are some of these groups?
Groups like Adoptees United, Adoptees for Justice, KAAN, which is the Korean-American Adoptee Adoptive Family Network, and the Adoptee Rights Law Center. These are organizations entirely led by adoptees.
They are doing the deeply unglamorous, exhausting work of walking the halls of Congress, taking meetings with staffers, trying to get politicians to care about a legislative loophole that the government itself created.
And their current legislative vehicle is a critical piece of pending legislation called the Protect Adoptees and American Families Act, or the PAAF Act.
Okay.
It is currently designated as H.R. 5492 in the House of Representatives and S. 2923 in the Senate. It was introduced relatively recently on September 18, 2025.
What are the specific mechanics of the PAAF Act? How does it differ from previous attempts, like the Adoptee Citizenship Act, which failed to pass in previous sessions of Congress?
The PAAF has 2 vital primary goals. First, it explicitly aims to close the citizenship gap by granting retroactive automatic citizenship to all internationally adopted individuals, regardless of their age when the original 2000 law passed.
So it entirely removes the arbitrary 18-year-old cutoff.
Exactly, ensuring that everyone brought over legally as a child receives the citizenship they were promised.
It honors the original contract of the adoption. And the second goal?
The second goal is what makes it so crucial and often so difficult to pass. It includes specific provisions that would allow previously deported adoptees, individuals like Adam Crapser, the legal mechanism to return to the United States, regularize their status, and reunite with their families and the only culture they have ever truly known.
Where does this legislation stand right now? Who is actually supporting it?
It has managed to secure bipartisan support, which is rare in immigration-adjacent legislation. In the House, it's sponsored by Representative Adam Smith, a Democrat, and Representative Don Bacon, a Republican.
And in the Senate?
In the Senate, it's being pushed by Senator Mazie Hirono and Senator Susan Collins. However, despite this bipartisan sponsorship, its current status is stalled. It's sitting pending in the House Judiciary Committee. It hasn't been brought for a vote. It's just waiting for action.
And while that bill sits dormant in committee, thousands of adult adoptees wake up every single morning living in genuine fear that a broken taillight or a routine traffic stop could spiral into a deportation order. There is a staggering, cruel irony here. You have a population of human beings who were imported to the United States as infants entirely without their consent to fulfill the desires of American parents.
Right.
And now, decades later, those same individuals are forced to organize politically, fundraise, and beg the very government that authorized their importation just for the basic right to legally exist in their own homes.
It is a profound injustice, and the urgency of the PAAF Act is a matter of life or death triage. But the exposure of the citizenship gap, combined with the evidence of the child trade and falsified origins, forces a much larger existential conversation.
It forces us to ask the big question.
Yes. If the foundational paperwork of international adoption was often fraudulent and the destination paperwork work was fatally flawed, and the whole system was driven by economic demand rather than child welfare. Can the institution of intercountry adoption be saved? Or should it be dismantled entirely?
That brings us to the deepest ideological divide within child welfare today. To frame this debate, we need to look at how the major international authorities have completely shifted their approach. The big players, UNICEF, Save the Children, the Better Care Network, have officially abandoned the rescue model.
They have. The global consensus among these major bodies has definitively shifted toward family preservation. This shift is entirely guided by a framework known as the subsidiarity principle.
Let's make sure we clearly define that. What does the subsidiarity principle look like in action?
Think of the subsidiarity principle as a strict, ethical ladder of intervention when a child is in crisis.
Okay.
The absolute first rung of the ladder, the highest priority where all resources and funding should be directed, is family reunification. If a mother is considering relinquishing her child due to poverty, the ethical mandate is to give that mother the financial support, food, and housing she needs to keep her child.
You fix the poverty, you don't remove the child.
Exactly. But if that first rung genuinely fails, or the parents are truly deceased, you move down to the second rung, domestic kinship care.
You find an aunt, a grandmother, an extended family member.
Right, someone within the child's own community to take them in. If that is impossible, the third rung is domestic adoption within the child's country of origin, so they retain their language, culture, and national identity.
And where does international adoption fit on this ladder?
It is the absolute last resort at the very bottom of the ladder. It's only to be considered when every single domestic option has been thoroughly exhausted and proven impossible.
Which completely flips the historical script of the 1980s and 90s, where international adoption was often the first, most heavily funded, and sometimes only option presented to a struggling mother.
Completely flips it. Coupled with this subsidiarity principle is a massive global push for deinstitutionalization.
The closing of orphanages.
Yes. Child welfare organizations have compiled mountains of undeniable evidence showing that institutionalizing children in orphanages, even well-funded, clean orphanages, causes severe long-term harm to early childhood cognitive and emotional development.
And furthermore, they argue that the very existence of orphanages creates a dangerous pull factor.
Yes.
What do they mean by a pull factor?
It means the institution itself creates the orphans. Often, well-meaning Westerners engage in orphanage volunteering or orphan tourism, bringing massive amounts of foreign donation money to these facilities.
So it creates an economic incentive.
Exactly, for the orphanage directors to keep the beds full. To attract donations, they need children, so they actively pull children away from poor but capable families to keep the institution funded. Deinstitutionalization aims to defund that entire model.
So the global authorities are moving away from the practice.
Yeah.
But what is the consensus among the adoptee community themselves regarding the future? Because the sources indicate this is a point of deep, painful internal friction.
It is a deeply fractured community. As we noted at the beginning, adoptees are not a monolith. When looking at the future of intercountry adoption, the community broadly splits into two ideological camps, the reformists and the abolitionists.
Let's map out the reformist position first. What do they believe should happen?
The reformists look at the grim history we've discussed, the corruption, the gap, the trauma, and they acknowledge all of it. However, they do not advocate for permanently shutting the system down.
Okay.
They believe the concept of intercountry adoption can still be a necessary, life-saving safety net, but only if it's intensely regulated. They demand a complete overhaul, absolute transparency in origin documentation, identity continuity where biological names and histories are preserved, and fully open records so adoptees can always find their roots.
They want to fix the machine, not destroy it.
Yes. And their rejection of abolition is usually rooted in a deep concern for the immediate practical reality of children currently suffering.
They worry about the kids stuck in the pipeline right now.
Or the children who genuinely have severe medical needs that cannot be met domestically. They believe that with enough oversight and ethical regulation, the system can operate safely.
That seems like a pragmatic, logical approach. But then you have the abolitionists. And their perspective is much more radical, though it stems from the exact same historical trauma.
The abolitionists look at the exact same physical evidence, the falsified documents, the child trade described by the TRC, the heartbreaking deaths of deportees, and they draw a fundamentally different moral conclusion.
How do they frame it?
They reframe the entire practice of intercountry adoption not as a flawed system of child welfare, but as a system of organized abandonment.
Organized abandonment. That completely rejects the premise of rescue.
It does. The core of the abolitionist argument is structural. They argue that a system fundamentally rooted in a transnational market, a system where thousands of dollars change hands for the transfer of a child, and where massive economic demand from wealthy Western nations exerts pressure on impoverished origin nations, can never be reformed.
The power dynamic is too inherently skewed.
The financial incentives will always corrupt the process. For abolitionists, you cannot safely regulate a market in human beings. The only moral, ethical path forward is to completely dismantle it and ban the practice entirely.
I have to interject here because I think a lot of listeners will have a strong reaction to that.
Sure.
Voicing a skeptical perspective, if we take the abolitionist route, if we completely close the borders and ban international adoption, what happens to the children who truly fall through every rung of the subsidiarity ladder?
Right.
The children who have absolutely no living relatives, who cannot be placed domestically because of severe special needs or because the domestic poverty in their origin country is simply too overwhelming.
Yeah, that is the question.
Doesn't shutting down the pipeline entirely condemn those specific vulnerable children to a life institutionalized in the very orphanages we just said destroy their development? Is the abolitionist cure actually worse than the disease?
That is the agonizing crux of the debate. It is a state of moral gridlock, and it is the most difficult question in child welfare. To understand how paralyzing this gridlock is, we can actually look at a microcosm of it that occurred inside the Korea Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
The commission itself was divided on this.
Deeply divided. Between April and May of 2025, the TRC actually had to suspend their ongoing investigations because a fierce internal dispute erupted among the commissioners over the fundamental evidentiary standard required to prove a human rights violation.
What were the two sides?
The commissioners split into two camps. One side argued a strict legal standard. They insisted that to confirm a case as a violation, the adoptee had to produce evidence proving intentional malice by the adoption agency.
They had to prove the social workers knowingly and purposefully falsified the paperwork.
Which, from a practical standpoint, is nearly impossible. You're asking adoptees to find a smoking gun of intent from 50 years ago, when the social workers are deceased and the archives have been lost or destroyed.
Exactly. It sets an impossible bar.
The other faction of commissioners argued the opposite. They argued that the widespread, systemic missing documents, the total administrative chaos, and the lack of government oversight was the violation itself.
The state's failure to regulate the market was the crime, regardless of individual intent.
Yes. So the legal dispute at the TRC perfectly mirrors the moral dispute of the abolition debate.
It really does. Proving individual malice or corruption in every single individual adoption is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
But the systemic generational damage caused by operating a transnational child market is undeniable.
So the agonizing question remains, do you keep a corrupted, market-driven system open to save the few children who genuinely, desperately need it, knowing with absolute certainty that keeping the market open will inevitably lead to the commodification and theft of others?
There is no clean, easy answer.
None at all.
So what does all of this mean? Where does this leave us right now at the end of this deep dive?
Well, let's summarize the massive reckoning we have navigated today.
The critical adoptee standpoint, fueled by a new generation of empowered adults, has permanently shattered the simplistic rescue myth.
Yes, they have forced the world to look at the dark, complex web of market demand, falsified origin documents, and the catastrophic legal abandonment that has resulted in deportation and death.
And we are currently witnessing the real-world results of this reckoning. The global pipeline is practically shutting down.
To give you a sense of the scale of this collapse at the peak of the boom in the 1980s, South Korea alone was exporting thousands of children abroad every single year.
And today?
In 2023, South Korea placed a total of only 79 children abroad. The era of mass intercountry adoption is effectively, historically over.
The market is closing. The pipeline is shutting down. But while that chapter of history ends, a profound, unresolved issue remains.
Because while the mass export has stopped, unparented, institutionalized children still exist worldwide.
The old rescue framework is dead and discredited. So what does genuine ethical global responsibility look like now?
Does the massive amount of wealth that Western families used to spend on adoption fees, often $30,000 to $40,000 per child, get redirected into family-strengthening programs and poverty eradication in origin countries, so mothers never have to make that agonizing choice in the first place?
The history has been written, but the future is an open, incredibly heavy question. As we end our deep dive today, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over.
The adult adoptees have forced the world to finally listen to their voices. They have exposed the child trade.
But when a state-enabled market in human beings is finally acknowledged and documented, what is owed and who decides?
Should origin governments apologize and offer financial compensation for the identities and families they actively erased?
And what is the enduring obligation of the United States, the largest recipient nation in the world, whose incredible financial demand actively helped manufacture the supply? If we are no longer the rescuers, what are we? We leave you to wrestle with that.